Good evening. I'm Rowley Sussex, Chairperson of the Library Board of Queensland. Welcome to the State Library of Queensland and to the Nielson Design Lecture 2010. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal and the Jagera people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of the State Library of Queensland on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people. We proudly continue that tradition here today by presenting the 2010 Nielson Design Lecture featuring our international guest speaker, Sir Peter Cook. I also acknowledge the Honourable Sterling Hinchcliffe, Minister for Infrastructure and Planning, the Honourable Rod Welford, Ross Nielson, Founder and Managing Director of Nielson Properties, Neil Roberts, President of the Queensland Library Foundation, Ewan McEwen and Fleur Watson from Unlimited, and Leah Giles-Peters, State Librarian. Tonight's Nielson Design Lecture is the second in an annual 3-year program of keynote talks that allow internationally renowned architects and designers to present their work, ideas, and methods to local architects, engineers, academics, corporations, and businesses associated with the urban environment. This partnership between Nielson Properties and the State Library of Queensland was established in 2008 through the Queensland Library Foundation in response to the expanding population and rapid development of the southeast region of Queensland and its capital city, Brisbane. With the theme, Designing Our Future, the series aims to inspire creative thinking for the future development of the region's built environment with a particular focus on the possibilities for public design. Through this partnership, the State Library of Queensland and Nielson Properties aim to create a space in which ideas can be exchanged and new relationships formed between local designers and policymakers and international practitioners. We are truly honoured to have Sir Peter Cook here tonight to present the 2010 lecture. The strength of this partnership has been widely acknowledged, and Nielson Properties, the State Library of Queensland, and the Queensland Library Foundation were recently announced the state winners of the Australian Business and Arts Foundation Awards for partnerships between arts organisations and small to medium enterprises. It is also tremendously exciting for us to be presenting this lecture as part of the Unlimited Designing for the Asia Pacific programme. Unlimited is a new international initiative supported by the Queensland Government to promote the value of design thinking in shaping a positive future for the Asia-Pacific region. The State Library plays a vital role in making powerful and personal connections to information and knowledge, bringing people together to consider and discuss issues of great importance to our state and the city's future. Design is becoming a key collection area for the State Library. Through the Asia-Pacific Design Library, which was launched earlier this week, the library aims to develop the best publicly available collection of design resources in the Asia-Pacific region, prompting contemporary thought and analysis on design. As custodian of Queensland's documentary heritage, we capture and record Queensland's contemporary stories for future generations. So Peter's presentation tonight will be added to our collection so it can be shared globally with an impact extending far beyond Queensland. This evening we'll see Sir Peter Cook present his keynote address. Afterwards, I would like to invite you all to join Sir Peter on the Queensland Terrace for some light refreshments. We will be both audio and video recording this evening's presentation. If you have any concerns about this, please let one of our staff know. And if you have a mobile phone, please turn it off. It is now my pleasure to invite Ross Nielson to come to the stage to say a few words.
Thanks, Rolly. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second annual Nielson Design Lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal and the Yurrugu people, the Honourable Sterling Hinchcliffe, Minister for Infrastructure and Planning, Professor Roland Sussex, Chairperson, Library Board of Queensland, Leah Giles-Peter, State Librarian, Neil Roberts, President of the Queensland Library Foundation, of course, Sir Peter, tonight's keynote speaker. We're very proud to partner with the State Library of Queensland to present this series of lectures by international leaders in the design field. We think it's an excellent opportunity to exchange ideas and form new relationships that will help drive the highest standards in designing Brisbane's future. My passion for development and design play in creating the personality of the city has been with me since really establishing my firm back in 1987. Over the years, we at Nielson Properties have demonstrated our commitment to the importance of good design, livability and environmental sustainability. We have invested in many innovative projects throughout southeast Queensland. We especially take an active interest in improving the built and the social structures within our city. It's about creating high quality experiences and creative lifestyle across a variety of areas, from technology to entertainment, fashion, food, and of course, design and the arts. Nielson Properties is strongly committed to the arts in Queensland with its long and successful relationship, as mentioned by Rolly, with the Australian Business Arts Foundation. Our partnership with the State Library also recognises the ongoing connection between the arts and the business precinct via the evolving North Quarter precinct, which is linked with the Coralpa Bridge. Creativity and design shapes our lives every day, whether we are aware of it or not. Whether it's the way people move about the city or the style in which people are housed, the design principles we apply play a very big part in determining the way in which people, businesses and communities interact and engage. Good design is not just about aesthetics, but it's also about functionality and environmental sustainability. Nielson Properties has recently completed building the Santos Place is Australia's largest 6-star green building and produces 60% less greenhouse gases to a similar sized convention office building. That's the same as taking 1,500 cars a year off the road. Sir Peter's groundbreaking and imaginative approach to architecture, I think, captures the vision and ambition that many in southeast Queensland have for the built environment, our public spaces and urban policies. Sir Peter's global experience and willingness to challenge architectural convention will certainly stimulate debate about the future development of our built environment. Creative thinking and ongoing debate between practitioners and also policymakers, I think, is vital to ensure our city remains fresh, vibrant and truly becomes a global leader in the field of design and architecture. Sir Peter says that he's always been an optimist and has always been interested in progress. His outlook aligns beautifully with both my personal values and I think the local values of inspired design solutions for better cities. So we're delighted to have here Sir Peter to be our keynote speaker for this year's Nielson Design Lecture, and I'd like to call upon the Honourable Sterling Hinchcliffe to introduce Sir Peter.
Thank you very much, Ross, and if I too can acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we gather, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people. Thank you, Ross, as Managing Director of Nielson Properties, for your leadership in bringing this series of lectures together, but I'll come to that in a moment. I want to acknowledge Professor Rolly Sussex, Chairperson of the Library Board of Queensland, Leah Giles-Peters, State Librarian, Neil Roberts, President of the Queensland Library Foundation, my former colleague, the Honourable Ron Welford, and Sir Peter Cook, our keynote speaker. Good, smart design is an essential driver in our economy, our society, and plays, as Ross made a reference to, plays a major role in our everyday lives. Good design is the key to making Queensland businesses internationally competitive. It supports and protects our environment and our way of life. You only need to look around the cultural centre precinct around here to experience the difference that good design makes. footbridges for city workers, stunning natural and built environments that encourage creativity and reflection, water-smart landscaping with an array of arts, recreation and knowledge precincts cleverly designed for easy access. We want to build on the exciting energy of our designers in all fields and ensure all government agencies are committed to promoting the integration of design into business, the community and indeed the public sector. This extends through to schools, hospitals and other public places. The Queensland Design Strategy 2010, launched in February last year, set out the first of 3 4-year blueprints on how to better integrate design into the commercial, public and community sectors. We are now on day 2 of the strategy's centrepiece, the first Asia-Pacific Design Triennial to occur in Brisbane, Unlimited, Designing the Asia-Pacific. This new and unique, exciting international design event has attracted international leaders in business, government, design and academia, cementing Brisbane's profile as a hub of design excellence in our region. I hope you're all enjoying the debate and discussion around some of our most pressing issues, from urbanisation and transport to food production, health and education. I hope you're inspired by the pioneering work of the design community to address these issues. I know it's been a really exciting time for all of us. Now, the State Library of Queensland's Nielson Design Lecture series is an inspiring example of how the public and private sectors can work together to raise design awareness in our community. I want to congratulate Ross and everyone at Nielson Properties and the team here at the State Library on the initiative, now in its 2nd year. This partnership is also a very deserving a winner of the recent Australian Business Arts Foundation Awards. But now let's come to the real thing that you've all been wanting to hear, not me. You're wanting to hear from Peter Cook. It's the inimitable Sir Peter Cook. His long-standing commitment to architecture has determined his place in the world stage as an innovative thinker and inspirational educator. In his early years as a member of the architectural collective Archigram, Sir Peter attracted international attention for his futurist visions of Britain's built environment that were underpinned by utopian technology and a classless society. But his most recent collaboration, Studio Crab, and I've got permission from Sir Peter to call it Studio Crab, with Gavin Robotham, has several projects in development, including a theatre in Italy, a social housing project in Madrid, and a musical centre in Taipei. It makes me wonder there's surely an opportunity here in Queensland soon, Sir Peter. These and other projects will document the next stage in Sir Peter's remarkable career. I look forward to hearing more from Sir Peter's vast experience and future vision for global design. Unfortunately, I have to step out, so I'll be taking up the opportunity that Rolly's mentioned, and I'll be accessing this through the State Library in the near future to pick up on the bits that I miss. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Sir Peter to the stage.
Good evening. Before I start the lecture per se, I'd like to thank Ross for putting the whole show on. I think it's very unusual to find a developer who is sensitive to good design and puts his money where his mouth is. And I think it's very unusual to find one who is actually still interested in what might come in the future, not just repeat the same old formulae. And also, since lots of people this evening are thanking people, I think it's very reasonable to thank Emma Spellman, who's been looking after me, who works here, has been looking after me brilliantly and carefully and imaginatively, which maybe with me you need to be. Also to thank Fleur Watson, who I think probably put the word in somebody's ear that perhaps I should come and do this gig this evening. I'd like to start with the first slide. Picture, whatever. Yes, it's a MacBook. And that's a little, they didn't pay me to put that on, but it is. I like the Mac. Some of you have paid $40 to be here this evening, and so no doubt those in particular wish to see the whole lecture out. Some of you came free, and for those of you who want to leave early, I've got 2 slides. You can say, you heard P. Cook, and to save a lot of bother, when I was a very young architect, I did this. It's called Plug-in City. It's in lots of books. You can read about it. It's on the web, and it was quite outrageous. When I was an older architect, about 8, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, I did this, which is you can go to Austria, you can walk in it, you can see it, and they do a very good T-shirt with the building on the front of it. Now you can go home, or you can listen to the rest, which will then slightly confuse things in the way of claiming to amplify them. In fact, this evening is 3 lectures. God help us. The first one is called Vegetable Architecture. The second one is called The City of Layers and Incidents. And the third one is called Towards a Non-Solid Architecture. I want to start not with the sort of hair shirt reasons for enjoying vegetation, but the romantic reasons. That, you know, you have to have a heart of stone or a head of stone not to get some immense elation from the mystery of this, the weirdness of it, the richness of it, the fact that it is always slightly intangible. And then if you start mixing conditions, if you start to introduce water, and after all, in this neck of the woods, you have a lot of water to overlay into the verdure and the trees, you get an extraordinary mixture of placidity and structure and layering and light and theatre. And it is no surprise that our traditional English painters often found themselves inspired to describe conditions of the landscape and the water. And then another thing starts to introduce itself with Enlightenment, which is people presumably engaged in sophisticated conversation amongst the trees with a hint of the built form somewhere in the distance. This interface between the building, the discussion, maybe there's a flirtation going on, maybe there's a meaningful statement being made, maybe somebody is irritated and somebody is hiding. We can sense the theatre in the picture. Now, here's a funny one, because that's not any of the old English romantic places. It's Los Angeles, where I was a week or 2 back, and I took this photo from somebody's house in the Hollywood Hills, looking down, I think, to the Wilshire Mile. And it suggests that there are other places where also the landscape is enjoyed as an adjunct of relatively civilized living. And in Japan, of course, one has this extraordinary tradition of conscious placement of objects amongst the trees, amongst the pools, of the positioning of something which is acting there perhaps as symbol, as temptation, as statement, as perhaps in some cases, a complex mixture of geometries and rituals. And if we go to the paintings, for example, of Caspar David Friedrich, you find that the concept of, again, a civilized condition with a very particular romantic architecture would be much less if it were without that group of trees. Take those trees away and the thing becomes just built constructs. Or, again, in the English 18th century, the invention of elements that sit inside the vegetation. That's really spooky stuff. That's weird shit. What's going on? What's going on there and there and there and there and there? There is a very interesting Japanese architect working now who does things like this, but it was actually going on way, way back. And then in the early part of the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century, Edwin Lutyens, a famous neoclassic architect, enabled the gardens to have quite minimalist kind of slabs of vegetation, which nonetheless set up a theatric condition. And then if we go into Germany, also in probably, I'm not a very good historian, but let's say it's some time back, I guess it was probably 18th century or early 19th, in the gardens of the Schloss Würzburg, if you analyze this particular picture, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 striations of vegetation, each with its own very distinct characters, but very distinct rules of control and exuberance, formality, informality. So we go from the extremely patterned condition here, the conscious enclosure, the constant tunneling, and then there we just let it go, these guys in Würzburg, let it go wild. What a fantastic and sophisticated range of devices. And in my more or less hometown of Bournemouth, developed in the 19th century, as soon as they brought the pine trees in from elsewhere in order to bind the sand, they introduced boardwalks. And these boardwalks, or their progeny, are still there. And again, back in Germany, in the Schloss Karlsruhe, in the 19th century, this extraordinary and strange enclosure was made with the intention of dangling vegetation that in the summer becomes a whole room and in the winter recedes back. And down the street, as it were, in Schwetzingen, also in central Germany, you got Italian gardeners who brought these trellises, enclosed space, conducted space, made slightly off the picture, but a sort of trompe-l'oeil theatre piece at the end of it. And then again in the summer, the vegetation takes over. So it is a kind of living, breathing architecture. And I think when I'd started to see this stuff, I started to design with it myself. So I moved from the kind of megastructure of the plug-in city to a softer megastructure, which in this case was intended to be a kind of museum, inspired, because I'd started to travel to Japan, inspired by the notion of setting up pavilions in space, but in this case in vertical space, and drifting the park between, and later inventing various gadgets that would sit into these vegetated enclosures. In fact, I think I did this before I saw the Karlsruhe example, and I was down in Germany giving a lecture, and somebody said, so is near this place, it's very like your thing. And you're always finding somebody says, somebody's done it before, you know. Often they say, it was done in 1403 or 1920. And I don't know, sometimes I think it's a bit of conspiracy. They want you to say, oh, you know, oh, my work is for naught, you know, it's all been done. Or you say, right, bloody good idea, wasn't it? And you carry on regardless, you see. So this is the plan of that same information city project. It's a bit pale here, but also then I started getting interested in putting gadgets into the trees, and I'll come back upon that you start mixing audio-visual systems into the trees. You start winding wires, you start draping drapes, you start combining equipment and furniture and enclosure into what is basically a vegetated structure. And I started drawing quasi-nature. Quasi-nature where if you look very, very closely, you can find there's bits of funny building. So it's a mixture of the natural with the architecture as a discrete insertion. And making paintings of the same thing, looking at what happens if you insert a piece of building into a hollow in the ground. So as you're walking along in the countryside, you don't see anything, and then suddenly, my God, you come upon the building, as it were, in a cutting. Or here, a kind of suburbanized notion where the street has the hedges, then there is the building, then there is a kind of grotto, then there is a formal garden with an orchard, but some of the bits of the orchard, reverse, are actually buildings themselves. So I'm constantly playing with this notion of what is not the built form, what is not the vegetation, what is not the cloaking of the built form. In this, which is an apartment block suggestion for Paris, there are a series of the actual apartment drums themselves and a sort of back garden that runs vertically up the back with little huts in it where you can escape and read the newspaper or grow marrows in the English tradition. I'm not sure whether the French would really enjoy that. And so one pursued more and more this notion of wrapping the built form with the vegetated form, sometimes as a cloak, sometimes as a drape, and so on. Or integrating it more so that in amongst the mix of apartments in this particular structure, there is also vegetated form. And the old English story of the secret garden fascinated me. Not that I particularly read it, but the notion of a secret garden, a formalized secret garden, when the door is opened, there's a wonderful thing in there, which again is on the theme that it appears to be a kind of bush. It appears to be a kind of bush, but in fact it hints that perhaps the bush is a building after all. And I keep returning to that theme. Here, in a sense, a more commonplace condition where at the bottom we see the plan, at the top we see the elevation from the street. From the street, you just see some bushes, some of them quite amusing, but just a walled street with a gate in it. When you come in through the gate into the house and turn backwards, the side of the bushes facing the house is much, much more funky and romantic and has all sorts of little episodes and special things happening. And this piece of the garden is a rotational vegetable garden, rotating crops. And I found, I'd done the project and happened to be with that bunch of students from London in Los Angeles, and in Pasadena, they were across the street photographing a famous building, which I'd seen before and didn't need to photograph. And I suddenly found this hedge, which was almost exactly what I wanted. It's like, life imitating art. It was almost the hedge that I'd designed in this project. Much more recently, only about a year or so ago, I was holidaying in Norway, which I often do in the winter, and take work with me. And I did this drawing. I invented a piece of countryside. I invented a strange piece of countryside. I'm not sure whether the projection is really quite doing it justice, but if we get close into it, it has pieces of drifting landscape, strange crevices, perhaps a piece of architecture, but who knows? And then more drifts, more drifts. More drifts again, and then a fissure which surely has to be constructed. It has certain hints of regularity. Man must have been there, and then you go back, another piece of architecture. And even these pieces, you start to look at them. And I made this up as I went along, in a sense. And you start to see that there is certainly quite deliberately pieces of folded architecture in amongst. Maybe there's cities sitting underneath there. But then also some strange conditions is that just a funnily colored leaf? Or is it too some kind of piece of art? I was, again, tinkering with this notion, where is the extremely delicate dividing line between the consciously designed and the as found, between the contrivance of vegetation and the contrivance of other hardware to make a building? And you start to see that one's interested in drift and repeat objects. Surely that must be something that does something, because it repeats rather regularly. So one's playing with one's own... and then it gets very naughty indeed, you see. There's no question that this one is some kind of very naughty construct. And he's laughing at himself. Well, wait a minute. Reality imitating art, perhaps, again. And you know that this is the Graz building again, taken at a certain angle where it appears to be popping out of the trees. I did a project a few years ago called the Veg House. I like calling it veg rather than the vegetable house. Veg, it's like meat and two veg. Sort of I like nonchalant terms sometimes, which doesn't make a big thing. This is not a vegetated house and entirely ecological. It's a veg house, you know. And there it is in the early stages. This is a plan, and this is a picture. This is an elevation. In the early stage, it's got a very big power plant. It's got a parking thing. It's on a cliff, and beds and a little bit of kitchen. Time moves on. The veg starts to creep in on the kitchen even. Starts to run around the appliances. The power pack is starting to get smaller. There's more things. The kitchen appliances are in amongst the garden, so to speak. But late stages, they're starting to plant things in the ceiling. You're starting to get all sorts of strange audio-visual sound rooms that are also parts of the bush. And funny old English terms like the dell start to come in quite intentionally, sort of almost 19th century romantic terminology, sloping and weaving and glades and folding and this sort of comfort, warmth, but at the same time becoming slightly spooky. And another stage, which it gets very spooky indeed. What is happening? What is happening? And as I continue drawing, the sixth stage, it gets so crazy, I stop, I say, it's sort of got out of hand. It's getting very interesting, but it's gone out of hand. I made a model of it, not at the very latest stage. The model is actually of about stage 2, when the thing still looks fairly circumspect. And from the idea of the veg house, why not the veg village? A series of houses interweaving and changing and folding into the landscape, and the landscape coming up to them, and little rivulets of water amongst hydroponic growing, tilling, covering, almost vegetated eider downs. And I found the other day this map of the Mississippi, where, in a sense, the physiognomy is very similar to my much earlier drawing. I'm fascinated by the idea, the conceptual idea of the marsh. And I think you have some swamps around this area which would interest me, because it is neither land nor is it water. It is water, but then it's land. It's this ambiguous, difficult, tricky condition. And I think it's not just conceptually interesting. I think it's one which we may have to face in certain parts of the world in the future, but I'll come to that towards the end. Fascinating condition, the marsh. My partner in crime, Gavin Rowbottom, actually comes from a village just off this picture, which is in the Broads of Norfolk. And we, together, in one of the Venice Biennales about 5 years ago, we made the two of us made a drawing of a prognosis of East London using the business of buildings amongst the water, buildings amongst the vegetation. Of course, some marshlands are extremely dramatic and extremely definitive. This is a marshland in Suffolk, which again is territory that Gavin and I know very well. And earlier on, a project that I did called Layer City, where one was deliberately drifting long territories of greenery in amongst the system of, in amongst the road system, and then deliberately thrusting some of the buildings out into the sea. Since I come from the seaside and I come from estuary territory, one is, of course, obsessed, if you like, by this mixture. In another fairly old project, I was draping a series of trellises and walkways and places for making growies into the water and then folding into the more formalized built structure. So one's been playing with these notions for a long time. But this is the Biennale drawing that we did, a very large drawing with a series of pieces of draped housing, studios, small factories, workshops. We ended up with 41 new, slightly weird typologies of use. And that, as an academic, has always been something that is, in the abstract, very interested. I've always been very interested in stretching the type. I was talking to Ross about this the other morning, stretching the typologies beyond housing, working, transport, library, to things, you know, since we carry so many things in our pockets now that we are all walking offices, except I've left mine in the hotel, but generally I've left my walking office in the hotel, perhaps subconsciously because I knew I wanted to give a lecture, but you know what I'm getting at. And we drew many of these hybridic objects, things in the marsh, in the water, almost going back to some medieval concepts of, or early maps and pictures of Holland and Eastern England, where you would drain a little piece of the territory and you would inhabit it, and maybe the rest would flood, maybe the rest wouldn't. And my friend Gavin has recently bought an old windmill in that region, which is 10 meters above the flood level. And so if he lives long enough, you know, the rest of the territory will fall into the sea, but his mill will still be in a preserve that might last another 50 years. Maybe that's negative thinking. Maybe it's just, it stimulates one's vocabulary of architecture. This is the same project in a piece of East London where one is looking at the mixture of allotments and small-scale organized plantation. One is looking at the possibilities of using vertical structures for growing. I borrowed this idea from some of the vineyards in Bad Kreuznach in Germany, and then also drapery of vegetation on some of the housing. And in fact, if you know where to look, even in central London, this is a piece of central London that I was probably walking past for 10 years before I realized that it enclosed in it was a piece of allotments. This is actually NW1. This is between, you come from England, I guess, and you know that behind the council estate of Hampstead Road, between Regent's Park and Hampstead Road, which looks as if it's a completely solid building, you probe inside there, and there's this enormous piece of allotments. And if it can happen there, think about it. Where else might it happen? So I suggest vegetation as a tectonic option. Very old drawing where one was suggesting a veg option in a patchwork of panel systems. Or here, which was a project that we designed for Madrid, got the client enjoying it, went in for planning, and then the bottom dropped out of Madrid's economic situation. So it's not going to happen. But here, there's a very old villa in the center of Madrid, one remaining villa of several that used to exist. And the idea was to wrap it with sort of a wall of housing and some drapes of vegetation with a little tiny watercourse running between the house and the rest. And it is a retail establishment. And here you see the system of the veg climbing up over the car park entrance and then winding around. And it would look somewhat like that. Actually, the other day I was in Seoul and I saw somebody had done one. And I thought, damn. But, you know, again, good idea. There you are. Ours would have been nicer than his, but of course. It goes. And there it is. And, of course, Jean Nouvel in Paris has done it very brilliantly. I think this is actually the best piece of his museum. We did, again in Spain, we won a competition for an office building in Murcia, again just at the moment when the bottom was dropping out of the economy. So this one won't happen either. And it is, in fact, an office building. I don't know if you can see the plan there. The two wings of offices are there, and then there's a kind of tube of vegetated space where there's a pool underneath, and by a lot of contrivance, you get a constant breathing of the cool air. And Murcia, after all, is very, very hot. And there are a series of devices, some of them computer controlled, some of them simply natural devices, which enable this continual cooling. And of course, very, very careful positioning, directional positioning of both openings and louvers. The projection is very pale, but you can see some hints of the mixed system of the damp core, and then contrivances with the louvers and underfloor air supply, so that you get this constant cooling of the building, and that is the end result. Okay, at this point I move on to the second lecture, so to speak, which is going to be called The City of Layers and Incidents. They're so heavily loaded that they were crashing if I put them all together, so it's better to just put up with this little bit of jiggery pokery, and then we... Right? Turn the light down a bit? This light? No, the top light. I don't know, I haven't got a switch. They didn't give me one. Right. The city is a series of layers and incidents. Which is my sort of post-rationalization of my amusement with looking out of the bus window, the car window, the house window from the street corner, watching what people do. I think that architects some architects either get careless or they stick very, very much to ordained rules, systems, ratios, ordinances, what was done before. I think life is far more interesting than that. I go out, sometimes my observation of life leads to quite bizarre concoctions and instruments. Sometimes it is a mixture of those concoctions and instruments and the knowledge of a particular place. This is actually a piece of a project for Oslo, and I have been visiting Oslo for 40-odd years and have probably clocked up something like 9 months in Oslo over many years. And consciously and subconsciously, I found after I'd done the drawing that it was almost a dead ringer for a bridge that was down the street and around the corner. On the other hand, there isn't a water arcade in Oslo at the moment, and my contention there was because there are 25,000 commuters by water in Oslo, and it gets very cold in the winter, I thought, what a pity they can't bring the boats into the building. Not such a weird idea. And so one is playing both inherited observation and then prognosis, in a way. There was a competition for a footbridge in Serbia. We entered the competition, we didn't win it, and then we discovered nobody had won it. They hadn't actually got the money. Well, it's one of those funny things. We did it because we liked the idea of doing a footbridge, and nobody had asked us to do a footbridge. And we had this idea, okay, there's the footbridge. And because I like kiosks, and you'll see that in a moment, I said to Gav, stick a kiosk on there. There's the kiosk on the footbridge. And Gavin said, wait a minute, we could make the kiosk move backwards and forwards along the footbridge. That would cheer things up in a boring Serbian town. And then I said, hey, wait a minute, that's the home of Sliverbits. Why don't we have a bar at the top so that the kids buy their chalk ice and their pop in the afternoon? And this thing is moving. You have to understand, it's not whizzing along at great speed. It's moving very, 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 very slow. And at night, at a certain moment in the evening, the flaps come down and they open the Sliverbits bar. And that can be a rather nice arrangement. And here it is, moving along the bridge, and there it is at night with the bar in it. As I say, they didn't have the money even to build an ordinary footbridge, so I offer this to the city of Brisbane. You've got some fairly interesting bridges so far. What you need is an Australian bubbly bar, which has chalk ices in the afternoon, of course, and then at a certain time opens for business. Probably in Queensland, the late old hour of 5:30. And maybe you keep it open even until 10. I'm not sure. And there you have your bridge, of course, which I think isn't a bad bridge. I believe it's controversial to say that. I think it's rather good, even if I did design one for you several years ago. This is pretty, what I like about it is by its sort of fun and games going over it, it maintains the notion of town rather than having a sensible bridge that just goes from A to B. I think it's the same instinct that we had with sort of, let's enliven it with a moving object. Somebody has enlivened it with an interesting sort of quasi-tensegrity structure. Why not? Many years ago, when I was a first-year student, and I started studying very early architecture, 16, I left grammar school and went to the local architecture school in Bournemouth, and I worked out of a thing. This is actually a Blackpool one, but it was very similar to this. I sat selling fruit, surrounded by wasps, for a whole summer. Very good for teaching you not to be fearful of wasps. And I was encapsulated in a capsule. I don't know whether this is the official version, but it does occur to me now after the event that the Archigram group's association with the idea of capsules was not only because we observed that they were beginning to do such things in Japan, not only because there was a space race, not only because we were interested in prefabricating and preforming and the building as a kind of industrial design object, but because I'd spent a summer in a capsule. And it wasn't so bad, apart from the wasps. And my wife comes from Tel Aviv, and I have visited many times Tel Aviv, which of course is a troubled city, you might think, but they have amazing fruit there. And this, which was a modernist object built by Scottish town planners and German-trained architects, these boulevards, and they established these little kiosks at the end of the boulevards, which still, and here's one that does absolutely roaring business. You can tell that the guy really enjoys himself and hangs. I remember doing that myself as a first-year student. I used to do mobiles made of apples and things like that, and I discovered a kindred spirit in Alive and Well in Tel Aviv. And of course, the other thing that I think is quite funny in the photo, I like incidents. Here's a guy. Tel Aviv has the largest number of startup electronics companies in the world. This is just a statistic. And there is one of these guys. He can't leave his bloody laptop alone. But he's also, his tongue's coming out. He's salivating and looking at his laptop at the same time. I think every picture tells, well, you've got these fruit places as well. Although my comment about these is that they start to lock into the architecture. I'm not sure whether kiosks should lock into the architecture or not. I'll come back to that a bit later, because when you go to Mexico City, here's a very funny one. Where does the architecture stop and the let it all hang out, Kosrupans world begin? Because this looks like a real ramshackle contraption, but somebody came and cemented it in. That is, you know, we can be very highfalutin about this, but it is really weird. If it's really ramshackle, the guy can pick it up and run along with it. No, but putting cement all around it. Very weird. I find things like that really fascinating. You go to Istanbul, they have hundreds of these, but they're all selling the same thing. Now, that's a funny psychology, too, because in Melbourne or in Tel Aviv, there are different ones selling different things. It doesn't seem to have got through Istanbul, which is otherwise a crazy place. For some reason, if you are on a little wheeled thing, you only sell these bread rolls. Weird. I find the psychology of that weird. And of course, with glasnost came the rotisserie chicken. Or, this is very much an archigram. If I described it abstractly, vis-a-vis some of our early work, I would say the conception of a mobile vehicle which has additional structure to deal with special climatic circumstances has an extremely sophisticated motivation and a piece of almost robotic equipment. I have described this thing. I've described Mr. Coffee, he's so frothy. Just happens to not be archigram styling, but it's the same animal. And of course, everywhere has its own culture. LA is a big town, so it's big. People are big, the vehicle's big, the burritos are big. That's LA. New York is a mean, tough town. So the food's small and the object's small and the guy is a bit depressed. And every picture tells a story. And recently we had been designing some kiosks for London. We would like them to proceed with these, we shall see. And we have a rather naughty looking kiosk. We have actually two sizes of standard component which can be computed together in many different ways. You probably can't quite see it, but this one is actually located between two of the buildings of Oxford Street in little pockets. And we offer a whole series of different options from different materials using the large component and the small component. And they can be opened out in a variety of ways geometrically, so that this is obviously the flower one. And this is obviously the soft drinks one. And not quite sure what that one's selling. There seem to be several of them grouped together. Somebody's doing something slightly mysterious in a shadowy way there. I guess he's buying a handbag, but maybe it's a handbag one. And what happens in the street, I think, is not just of casual interest. I think it's a key issue. Where does the again, it's this theme, where does the building proper stop? Where does the humanity of a town or city begin? There is, after all, a healthy tradition, not just of busking, but actually of almost prepared spaces for the theatre, the casual theatre to occur. We won a competition in Italy. Always the problem of winning a competition in Italy is that it's Italy. Don't hold your breath from getting the building up necessarily, but we're hopeful. This is in Verbania, which is in the north of Italy on Lake Maggiore, and it's the municipal theatre. And we were very keen to use that same notion of the immediate outside space where perhaps the real theatre would happen. I mean, there is, of course, an auditorium. There is, of course, a foyer and a restaurant. But the notion is that a lot of casual activity would also happen, particularly as here on market day. If we look at the aerial view of the project, we see that actually it is occupying a corner of a very large old square. And the high part of our building resonates to the high part of the adjoining site, the low to the low. And this house is very important in the history of the town. It's a politically very significant house. And so what we did was to carve the territory around it as a kind of open-air theatre as well, where movies could be projected onto the side of this house, and that you attend it via this route here. And then the market, when it happens, takes place here. That's the scheme of things. Of course, there's a lot of contrived carving and fluting and designing, which passes through the computer. But the end game is that it's of its materiality and of its colour, and we think even of its sizing, sympathetic to the town. And here's the system of the building with the old house, the route in, the formal foyers, the auditorium, bookshops, rehearsal rooms, small theatre, and so on. We are hopeful, but I say it's Italy, you'd never quite know whether they mean business or not. And here's our friend, the friendly alien, the dog. I think he's like a dog, you know, he fits very comfortably into the town. And, you know, however weird you think this might be, if you look at those guys in the 18th century, they were doing some weird shit too, you know. It's not without tradition. It really isn't. And it was built 2 months late. I like to say on budget, on time. It was 2 months late, and it was 2.5% over budget, which for an arts building is I think, you know, virtually on the line. Very funny thing happened when we won the competition for this, and we started working on it. And one of the things was that we had to be very respectful of tradition. Of course, we're very respectful of tradition. We had to be very respectful. We had to preserve this building, which is called the Eisener's House, the Iron House, the oldest cast iron structure south of the Alps in Austria. And at great expense and loss of life, it had to be propped up because it was it wouldn't have held public usage. It was about 120 years old, I think, or 150 years old. And we inherited, had to pump lots of concrete behind steel and keep the bloody thing up, and then backfill with our own building. But halfway through the process, somebody got hold of the real original drawings. The bits came from Sheffield. So much for the indigenous culture. There were some loonies from England doing stuff in the early 19th century. There were some more loonies from England doing stuff at the end of the 20th century. So much for indigenous. And of course, you have a lot of imported stuff from Sheffield here in Brisbane, I think, if you know where to look. Don Watson has taken me on more than one occasion to see these things. And the other thing about the building was, not only did Colin at the time have a girlfriend from Graz, I had been there probably about eight different times, usually with students. And I knew the site because the site was near where the only place you could get a drink in the middle of the night. So one gets to know the site, you see, in that way. And the system of organizing, because we knew the site very well, we knew which is the noisy side and which is the quiet side, where the trees are, where the funny people hang out, where the view of this and the view of that is. It made it easy to be perhaps rather more experimental than in a town where you have to play it very much to the rules because you don't really quite know. Anyway, the site was a very difficult site, not a 4-square site, but one which had this Eisener's house here, and then you had to keep these rather third-rate Baroque houses there, and you had a sort of funny piece. And what we did effectively was almost to treat it like squeezing out ketchup on a plate. We went sort of, and it just filled the available space, and there it is. We knew that this was the corner where everybody would come in. There wasn't any argument about this. We knew that that was the obvious place to put the goods entrance. That had views, therefore you put the cafe. I mean, it's sort of, it's easy to say, it's sort of designed itself. And it has certain elements of heroics. The basic exhibition spaces are a secret. There's a kind of secret casket above the ground, and the restaurant and everything is really an extension of the street. It's just as part of the riverside. And then there is this special parade, which I will come to in a moment. There's the parade. You go up a travelator into the secret casket, 2 floors of exhibition space, and then if you've still got some stamina, you make it onto this parade, and suddenly this valley, which is the valley of the River Mur, which is the southern side of the Alps, becomes your art piece. In fact, it's the best art piece of the lot. It's actually the valley and the castle on the hill. It is not a high-tech building. We didn't have a high-tech budget. It's what I call a crap-tech building. It's kind of using, in a sense, still the same, intellectually, it's the same game as was played by the people who put the tiles. They manufacture some pieces, they put them next to each other, and let the water trickle. Manufacture some pieces, put them next to each other, and let the water trickle. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but in essence, it's that. This is a photo taken around about the time when it first opened, when there wasn't an exhibition in the building. And for some very strange reason, people are all crowding around there. We had these light nozzles. There are about 14, I think, of the light nozzles, and because they're bringing a certain amount of light in, they're facing north. Fair dues. Except for the naughty nozzle. They all face, except he's facing there. What's going on? All these people are looking. Why? Because they see the castle. Now, if you go to Graz, anybody who's been to Graz, you can't miss the bloody castle. It's up on a big hill. There it is. There's the castle. Looks like a cuckoo clock. There it is, the castle. But when you've been through, half an hour or an hour of art, maybe you want to look at the castle. It's actually, it was an idea taken, so to speak, out of the back pocket, because many years before, we'd done an exhibition in London where we had also built a kind of cocooned internal object. And we had, it was Mike Webb's idea of Archigram, had this idea of a periscope that would go out of the window and picked up the view of the London red buses going by at the end of the street. Most of the people going through the exhibition had probably come in the bus. But it's weird, they queued up to look at the bus that they'd just come in. We thought, that's not a bad idea. Let's store that one. And when it came to Graz, bloody castle across there. Let's feature the castle. And it works. People still queue up to see the castle, but they've just seen the castle. They've just probably been in the castle. I think that tells you a lot about psychology, this business of push, pull, hold, release. You know, look again at what you can't get, kind of thing. I'm fascinated by these strange things. Even in the same building, the fact that we have a travelator, which is usually something used in a railway station. It's a nonchalant thing. And I'll name drop, I had the delight of accompanying the Chancellor of Austria up the travelator, and we both had glasses of white wine in our hands, and instead of the sort of, bowing and scraping, he got the bloody travelator. It was fine. He enjoyed it. Why not? And I like, there's a particular thing that you're sort of playing footsie with the traditions of Austria, which are extremely formal. There's a lot of bowing, and they still recognize members of their non-existent royal family, which is very intriguing. Maybe you'll do that when you've got the new flag. Of course, we have 920 pixels of light with 100 degrees of intensity available. So you can actually show movies on it. And a lot of competitions have been held for designers and artists to program the building. It's a regularly changed program so that you can use the surface. For those of you in the audience who are architects, I came across these from our Klaus Bollinger, our engineer, the other day, and he passed them on to me, which are records of certain stages of the construction. When I say it's crap tech, you will see that indeed so it is. It only uses very straightforward steelwork. Bollinger is a brilliant engineer, and for those who know about these things, he does all the structures for Co-op Himmelblaus buildings. But you'll see that it's actually, and these pieces were prefabricated in a little shed up on the hill, and it's many layers of insulation, because in such an art museum you have to maintain extremely precise climate control. And it would have been impossible without the computer. It took only less than 2.5 years to build at great speed with 27 different subcontractors on a very tight site, because so much could have been predicted by the computer. And I think, apropos my early work, one might say that one might have come up with something vaguely like this. Let's say that one had in the 70s and 80s. But without the computer, it would have been just unbelievably expensive and unbelievably slow. We didn't have 5,000 Egyptian slaves available. And I think the computer, therefore, that is the significance of the computer for me. It makes things possible. And this picture is now used by the Austrian government. You see it in airports, with the caption, "Austria, the land of the old and the new." Except it took a couple of British loonies to carry it out. Sometimes I go to Britney Spears concerts. In fact, I only went once. The fact that I also went to hear Beyonce in the same fortnight has diminished my reputation as a lover of classical music. But I digress. What is interesting, Populous, who are friends of mine, and I do things with sometimes, got me into one of their buildings. This is their Dublin O2 Centre, and there is Britney Spears miming and doing whatever else. But what was really interesting to somebody who is interested in the soft architecture, the gadgets, the coming and going, was the fact that her 100 guys arrived in from America the night before, dumped all this gear into the O2 Centre. And that was the state of play about 6 hours before that. That also is the architecture of not high-tech, another kind of time-tech, let's call it. We won a competition for a pair of university buildings about 2 years ago, and we are now right in the thick of constructing it. But it coincided with the moment when my own son was starting to contemplate going to university. He's just started this year. And I also, of course, as is well known, have taught in a number and lectured in even larger number of university establishments. I have been, I like to think, a joke academic for a long time. And I watch what goes on. I'm fascinated. Here's my son and his friends in our garden 2 years ago. These kids are now all sitting in boring concrete boxes. It's scary to think of that. I really think as architects we have to be ashamed of the university buildings that in general we make, which are tiresome and only done to please the sort of bean counters and the cleaners. These kids shouldn't be condemned to those sorts of buildings. Yeah, they are, you know, they're daft, they're enjoying themselves. Okay, with a certain amount of order, you know, there is a table, there is an enclosure, but that, I really feel strong about it. Now, here is the courtyard, the outside of probably one of the best architecture schools in the world, which is SCIARC in Los Angeles, an old railway building, which is about 1/3 of a mile long. On a Friday night, they want to go out and have drinks. You know, they have their Friday night beer night, like many other places. And they're very bright students. So somebody has sadly, almost pathetically, put up a slightly drapey, flimsy, naughty structure just to say, come, we haven't got any vegetation here. We haven't got any nice lake or anything. It's a brilliant building in many ways, but hard as hell. Come out and enjoy. It's a cri de coeur. Or here, a very different place, a long tradition, somewhere I visit frequently, and CJ knows this building too, is the garden of the École Spéciale d'Architecture in the center of Montparnasse in Paris, a private architecture school with a delightful garden. They're slightly laid-back students, it has to be reported, but there's a wonderful thing of this piece of real estate in the middle of Montparnasse, which cannot be built over, and which gives them at least somewhere to play the hula hoop. With that sort of thing in mind, and it was a 3-stage competition, and I managed to not blow it with this little drawing that I made in the 2nd stage of the competition, where I suggested that academic activities don't just consist of sitting in front of laptops or books, that all sorts of nice, naughty things can go on in Austrian academe. And why not? The terrible thing is the number of academic institutions that I've lectured in or visited where they shut up at 4 o'clock, or maybe it's 4:30. It's dead as a dodo in the evening. People don't want to be there. The good places are the ones that they really want to hang out. And the best experience I ever had was in the Oslo School of Architecture many years ago, when they still had dogs and children and red wine bottles on the windowsills and white wine bottles in the fridge and funny cakes and naughty things going on in the corner and a lot of hard work. They were the hardest working students I've ever had. And it was bloody cold outside. I suggest that the 2 things went together, that it was an enjoyable environment, it's a real living place and not some place where the guy's dangling the keys at 5 o'clock in the evening. I feel strongly about this. And so therefore, in the design of our own building for Vienna, for the Economics University of Vienna, which is the law school and the administration building, we sketched lots of funny things with this was where the library, we called it the cake of knowledge, but then they told us we had to drop the cake and drop it underground. But where we have still, even though we've had to cut millions of euros off the original budget, we have still kept these special breakout spaces and nooks and corners and places where, my goodness, naughty, naughty, you can even go out and have a smoke. Ooh. And you can walk through the building and under the building and through pieces. And bearing in mind that here is the Prater Garden, the old hunting grounds of the Habsburgs. And so we have these re-entrant conditions, these places where you can step out and step around, trying to hang on to the notion. Here is the coffee shop, which is a sort of cheerful corner piece of the building. We've just been working on that last week. Here is part of the roofscape of the library, and the library is tucked under the roof. This is the plan of the library with learning capsules, talking capsules, different layers and ventilation places and places where plantation, this is planting happening here, on and around the building. Constantly thinking of those principles that one is to make it enjoyable to be there. And it's now in very advanced stages of design, and work is already on site. This is the library, which also we've been working on the last few weeks in detail. And it is at a very advanced, as I said, a very, very advanced stage of planning, and there's already dust on site and pieces of mock-up, and that will be there quite soon. And the sort of notion of the building is that it is layered in timber. It has coloured stripes moving up as you go from the ground to the top, and there is a wood in front of the building. There is light-breaking wood in front of the skin of the building, and then the striations of the building and the pockets of space inside, and that is that architecture. And I move rapidly on to the last little lecturette, which is called non-solid architecture. Non-solid architecture. I've only just started using this phrase. This is only the second lecture where I've even used the phrase. I thought of it about 10 days ago to try and summarize where I feel I am at the moment in terms of objects. I have had a very odd career, which is that I didn't really build anything till I was nearly 50. And I didn't have any children till I was nearly 50. And people said, have children to change your life. Simultaneously, they said, you start building it to change your life. I don't know whether it has. I think they were just trying to keep you off the case in both cases. But it does occur to me that once you do start building, as a sort of ideas person, as partly a theoretician and partly a teacher, that you do get enormous amount of feedback from the actual hardware, from the feel of things, from the shadow of them, from the presence of the object. One thing I discovered was that the actual presence of the object, if I look at this room, it's not where that door is placed, it's how deep it is. It's whether you put the edge around it, whether the edge is the right sort of colour, the right feel, whether the edge of this platform, not that it's the right size or the right height, but to what extent it resonates as something to touch, to see. That sounds very sort of arty-farty, but believe me, that is the difference between designing without building and designing with building. Nonetheless, I think there is consistency of one's attitude towards re-examining the typologies. In the early days, one did the plug-in city, which in a sense was an anti-city, because it was in love with the idea of city, but one wanted to pick it away and say, does it really have to be permanent and solid and built foursquare and lumpy and chunky? And I still feel that, even though I wouldn't, as you might notice, design it in exactly the same way right now. When one did a plug-in university, perhaps the plug-in university is much more a complete toy than the university building that we are now making. But there are some consistencies. And one did a floating instant city, a traveling city like a circus, because one was interested in the notion of the city as a summary, as a sort of box of tricks, as a series of experiences, and that the institutions of the city, the concerts, the galleries, the libraries, the information, the mix of people, was perhaps something that you could put on the road and drop down by a small town or a village, and for a week or a couple of weeks, that place would be a city. And then the city would move on and leave a sort of afterburn, a sort of glow. Probably naive, but, you know, the circus would come to town. And it was, after all, close to the period when the pop concerts, the Woodstock festivals, these things were happening in the US of A. One suggested that the village, the habitat, could be allied to a hovercraft. It could come, it could do its thing, and then it could go. There would be a symbiosis between the notion of the vehicle, the industrial design object, the community, and the rescue machine. Sometimes one made plans that, again, rather like the veg house, metamorphose between a simple state, a more complex state, and a very complex state. I seem to remember, CJ, that you helped me draw that one way, way back then. And the notion of percolation, this notion of non-solidity, and surely this is very appropriate in Brisbane, which surely can be a non-solid town. It doesn't have to be a solid town. It should wallow in its forestation and its slightly swampiness. Why not? Very early days, I made this tower, which was a kind of collage of pieces strapped to an armature. We sent up our towers. We made a pop-up book of the Archigram magazine, both saying, tee-hee, enjoy, and we are serious too. Beware of the Inglesi when they are making a joke. They're probably at their most serious. Towers have, although I'm not very good with heights, as you may have noticed, I find towers very fascinating as an armature upon which to hang various ideas. This is another one of a series of metamorphic towers. This is one out of a series of 8 taken at roughly the middle stages. This is a tower for the part of London near where I live called Hampstead. And because London is damp, I called it Dampstead. And it collects the water at the top and then lets the water slowly, slowly, slowly trickle down the face of the building. And because it comes down to a tiny point, it uses up less of the land. This is a tower for Tel Aviv, which is a series of different activities as a series of strati, or as a series of, almost like a club sandwich, where you stick the thing up and then you put the, you know, the turkey, the ham, the bun, the tomato, the gherkin, and you pile it up. A device for carrying several buildings. Or for Oslo, again, the city I've been to many times, a tower which uses the tradition of light in the dark evenings. Because they have very cheap electricity and they have a lot of dark evenings, one makes this set of buildings as a series of lanterns. The little lanterns at street level, the bigger lanterns at window scale, the bigger lanterns at room scale, the bigger lanterns at apartment scale, and finally the whole of the top apartments as a giant lantern. It's this notion of taking the tradition of the bay window, tradition of the lantern, and welding it together as a tower formation. Some of the towers, of course, get very, very spooky and almost animal-like. And this drawing, in its correct coloration, is upstairs. It's amazing. It's the first time I think I've ever been to give a lecture somewhere with a very old drawing that actually is sitting upstairs. It's on loan. And there was when I was here in the 80s, there was an amazing gallerist called Ray Hughes. Those in the, I have to do try to imitate the Ray Hughes voice, physiognomy, but amazing guy who used to take you to restaurants and then almost get you slung out of the restaurant. He was so outrageous. I think he's moved to Sydney. And he put on an exhibition of my work. And I did this drawing sitting in Indrapilli. I set the project to the students, and then I quietly did the project myself as well. And this is your river. One side is the arts district, and the other side is the other side. And I suggested that there could be two types of occupied tower. Here you see the plan of it with its sweeping routes crossing the river. No moving capsules at that stage. Here is a sort of air-conditioned office tower. I think it predates Mr. Foster's Gherkin, actually, and Mr. Nouvel's Barcelona building, may I be so bold as to note. But this piece was a direct result of Don Watson's tours with me, showing me all the verandas of the old Brisbane houses. And I said, that veranda thing, it really is a great thing. Let's try and do apartment blocks that have developed verandas and trellises. Verandas, not balconies, as I was saying the other morning. There's a big difference between the trellis and the wall. There's a big difference between the vegetated architecture and a bit of green somewhere down somewhere else. There's a big difference between a veranda and a poxy little balcony. And here we are with, it's quite interesting, the left-hand side of the drawing, I redrew it. I didn't redraw it, I recolored it from the original black and white drawing. And somehow, the left-hand side has been published and used much. It sits in the RIBA collection in London. The left-hand side has become more popular than the whole drawing, which is a pity because I may be disagreed with by some of you, but I always thought in the 80s that this was a very, it does funny things with the edge of the waterway, but it is a particularly elegant piece of roadway. The actual fashioning of these columns is not to be thrown away. I've been to many, many cities in the years between that have got freeways at the edge of water, freeways. The only other one that I've seen that's even nearly as good is in Mexico City. But it's a very good piece of routeway, and I'm sure you can move through it and carve through it. And I think I was inspired by it, you know. Very recently, I did this drawing, which the drawing has just been bought by a French banker, strangely enough, and who develops in the Middle East, so I have hopes. Anyway, it is again folded architecture. The vegetation is being folded in amongst the more circumspect ETFE skinned building. The depot is here. The studios are there, the sound studios are there, and then there's more vegetation and movable parts of building and static parts of the building. The notion of the aerated city in a recent project, we look at the idea of not filling the site in solidly, but of dangling a series of pieces of building over. The components of the building have their function and their different origins, and they're put together as a kind of collage, but a loose collage, not a tight, fixed, total collage, allowing the building to drift. Again, this is another Travelator core building with a series of interdependent parts, draped and draped and draped and draped. The water end, the drapes and the stripes. There is some contiguity between this and our Vienna building, let us say, the notion of the striated colours. But also it's an exercise in loose fit. This is the plan of the whole building with the components drifting slightly loosely one upon the other with a lot of air percolating between. And the garden at the bottom even weaves through the building, in amongst the building, and continues into the city. In another case, in Pinto, in the edge of Madrid, was another version of a place, because it gets very hot and dry in the summer in that part of Spain, of blowing winds through between the buildings, encouraging a boardwalk which would have all these kiosks in it, and the kiosks are tucked under the major buildings. This piece of master planning was not proceeded with. This is the golf club house, this is a hotel, this is another hotel. These are housing blocks, more housing blocks, and the golf course here. And here is this boardwalk where the lads of the village would parade along. You know, the idea of the flaneur that comes out on the weekends, or the jogger, jogging away, showing off really. And the old guy with the stick, you know, leaning and looking at the girls, and all these, and people playing tennis up on the roof. It was a sort of folding process, part of quite a big project that I did together with Salvador Perez Arroyo in Madrid. And there is again an old Archigram idea of the inhabited garden, the garden with audiovisual devices and screens, and of course plenty of vegetation wrapped in amongst. And this is the golf club, probably cousin of the Graz building. It didn't go ahead, but then was a commission from the city of Madrid for some social housing. And again, one repeated the same basic formula, which is to say, let's lift the skirts of the building, let's lift the building off the ground and allow free-form kiosks and other small structures to inhabit the underside. This part of the building is extremely tightly planned. And in a sense, conceptually, it works rather like a hamburger. Underground are 3 floors of parking, like the base bun. Overground are 9 floors of housing, the top bun. The topping are the sports facilities, and the filling is real life in the form of the kiosks. The city has been very weird about it and said, we want you to design the kiosks. And Gavin and I said, but, you know, the whole point is that they're kiosks. We've got, you know, we've got between us many years of expensive architectural education. Maybe we shouldn't do the kiosks. No, you must do the kiosks because they've got to be approved. Well, so we're now doing parody kiosks, which is a little bit different from the London ones. Anyway, it is now rolling ahead after a hiccup where it got this far. They went bankrupt. They found another builder, and now it's rolling away. And there it is with its skirts lifted up, ready to put things inside it. The plan of the sports facilities, small-scale sports facilities at the top, and suggested layout of kiosks and little pieces of garden at the bottom. Way back with another architect, Christine Hawley, we experimented very much with the notion of the aerated building, the notion of building of a series of trellises and meshes and shadows. And so back to those pictures of the trees, the mystery of looking through layers of substance. With Populous, I once did a project for Liverpool where we didn't completely cloak the building. We put a sort of gossamer layer of enclosure, which is where one's involvement comes in with the early stages of the Olympic Stadium, which is now racing ahead, where we were experimenting with all kinds of layers and some quite extraordinary drape ideas, which are a little bit, perhaps a little bit more expensive than the ones that are now being used. And I like fruity stuff. I really like fruity stuff. I was sitting last summer, my wife and I were both teaching in Los Angeles for a few weeks, and we stayed in Santa Monica on the seafront, which is a very agreeable thing to do if you come from cold northern Europe. And our window looked back to another hotel about a third of a kilometre inland. An expensive but blocky, grey, grim, miserable, castle-like hotel. We said, bloody hell, you know, people have gone all the way to Santa Monica. It's the end of the west of the west of the west. It's wonderful. And they sit inside this miserable castle. And so I started drawing, and I said, what would happen if that hotel enjoyed itself? So that was that drawing. Or another version of enjoying, this is called the Comfo Veg Club. It's vegetated, it's comfortable, and it's a club. On offer to any club proprietor that there might be in After all, the world is in colour, even though the colours that are being projected this evening are not quite accurate. Doesn't matter. Our building in Vienna uses two systems of coloration. The basic stripes run from earth-like dark colours near to the ground and then become lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. But the carpeting internally does the reverse trick. In the lighter rooms, you have the dark floor, and then the floor gets lighter as you go deeper into the bowels of the building. In a project, a competition which we did not win for Birmingham, Birmingham, for anybody who knows the English scene, is a funny old town. It cannot be claimed to be beautiful. It may be enterprising, may have the best Indian food, but it ain't beautiful. And the task was to skin a terrible place called New Street Station. Our skin consists of a colour system which runs from red through the spectrum and organized so that the red faces face rather red-coloured streets. The blue piece faces the late lamented Jan Kaplitzky's blue building, and the yellow, the pale colour, faces the south where it would reflect the sun. And we developed it, you'll see in the last slide, that we developed it largely by making a physical model and sitting around the model and literally sculpting the project. Though computer drawings were used as well, of course. In another project, more recently, one looked at a strip of Taiwan where one moves from the city end of the site to the country end of the site. The city end of the site is rather more formalized, and then the buildings get looser and the colors change. So one's using both the physicality of the buildings as a kind of melt, and one's using the colors as a kind of melt. And we run quickly through it, the colors of the little pavilions and restaurants, and then the big auditorium. And then as you reach the other end, it gets wilder and wilder and wilder, but the buildings then become more and more monochrome. So there's another, one's playing with variation, but on a sort of system of variation, if you like. Another project where one is again experimenting with color. And various projects where we're layering color. And sometimes, of course, we say, hold it, hold it, hold it. Let's just go for white. Let's see what happens if we just go for white. But at night, we don't. Let's go for blue. In this particular competition, which was for Latvia, the Latvians said, we don't want one of those here. And in Estonia, because Gavin is very interested in black tar, and his mill is covered in tar, we said, let's go for tar. It's a cold Baltic north. It's not so very different from Norfolk. It's a ship. It's a bastion against the weather. Let's cover the thing in tar and then wind the ground around the tar building and let the light do strange things internally. Finally, facing Armageddon, are we? Our country is going to be flooded, so they say, particularly Norfolk and Suffolk and the places I've just been showing drawings of. What do? We look at bits of London and we start planting. We start planting strange, not even high-tech, not even crap tech, but scrubby tech, gather tech structures. We wind them around. We wind bits of wood and driftwood and flotsam and jetsam around these structures, and we let the floods start to come in. And they come in more. Maybe we float mustard and cress in the sky. And we inhabit these things with not very neat, but circumspect bits of construction. You don't have to use proper contractors. You build the basic. It's a sort of megastructure in a funny way. And then you survive within it and gradually climb up it. Finally, some pictures of how we actually operate. It's a crazy office of about 15, 16 people at the moment. There are people at computers doing normal things. There are people arguing their cause. There are people making a mess. And sometimes the old members of Archigram come and visit. Mike Webb comes and draws aeroplanes. David Green criticizes them. And Gavin Rowbottom, who also loves aeroplanes, looks on interestedly. And we design around bits and pieces. Thank you. Usually at this point in the proceedings, I either take questions, which I think I'm not going to this evening. You can come and ask me over a drink, or I bugger off. But this evening, I have the great pleasure of presenting to Professor Rowley, Sussex. I don't know if it's Rowley of Sussex or Rowley Sussex. You sound like you might come from. Two books which have a sort of sentimental attraction to me. The first book is actually written by my wife, Dr. Yael Reisner, in cooperation with Fleur Watson, who's sitting there in the second row. So Yael and Fleur made this book, which I am actually in there on page 86, actually, since you didn't ask. A number of us have been interviewed at great length, including Zaha and Tom Main and all sorts of weird people. And Yael has that ability to worm things out of people. She's from Tel Aviv, and she's insistent after several interviews. People start saying weird. It's particularly interesting, I think, in terms of the footnotes. And I have great pleasure. I wrote on her behalf to the State Library. Yael would be proud that you have an early copy of her book. Professor Sussex, that is the first book. The second book is what I've done myself. Both of these books are available from all good bookshops and are cheaper on Amazon. Don't be put off by the price in the shop. And this contains some of the drawings that you've seen this evening, not by any means all, and some by even some people sitting in the audience, aren't they, CJ? And I think that's nice to have in the library too. And I'm delighted that they're there in the library. I'm delighted the drawing is upstairs, and I'll come and do your building if you want one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Peter Cook, for your remarkable, enthusiastic, eloquent, inspiring, and brilliantly imaginative address. I love scholarship, practical scholarship, which shows evidence of such high good humour. I'd never thought of the Graz Space Lab as being effectively raspberry design. I won't try and imitate Peter's version of how he filled the spaces. The notion of non-solid architecture and towers as percolations of spaces have made me think quite differently about the structures that I see every day, or the ones that I might imagine. And the notion of an aerated city is one which I think is very relevant to Brisbane. You have in fact shown us many enchanted gardens and left us with that splendid phrase, what would happen if that hotel enjoyed itself? Think of the Birdsville pub, yes. So, Sir Peter, thank you very much for a quite extraordinary and memorable address, and for presenting us with your book, drawing, and with architecture and beauty as well for the library, which we'll value them very much. Thank you to Ross Nielson and the Honourable Sterling Hinchliffe for their sponsorship and being present, and thank you all for coming to this very special evening. We invite you to join us on the Queensland Terrace. We hope you've enjoyed yourself, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.